everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Chris, and today we are here in my raised bed for video number 3 in my series of what I feel is most important to consider when you're starting a garden. Today, we are going to be talking about soil. So soil is one of those things that you can't grow a plant without it. Unless it's an air plant, then you can grow it without soil. But vegetable gardens and most plants need some type of soil in order to grow. There are a lot of different considerations to think of when you're thinking about the soil for your garden. Soil also ties into the location of your garden if you're planting an in-ground garden, because you're going to want to know what type of soil you're planting in. The major types of soil are clay, loam, and sandy soil. Clay soil tends to be dense. It compacts easily because it is so dense. It holds a lot of water, which means it doesn't get very much air in the soil itself. Clay soil tends to get very hard, and when it's dry, it tends to crack. Because clay soil cannot retain a lot of air within the soil itself, decomposition in clay soil tends to happen at a much slower rate. Organic matter requires air in order to decompose. Plants need organic matter to decompose because it isn't until after the decomposition process that the nutrients in that organic matter is available for the plants to take in. That means that clay soil is typically not your ideal soil to grow most plants in. The plant roots have a hard time kind of working their way into the soil because the soil tends to be really hard. And they also have a hard time taking up those nutrients because of the lack of air and the slower decomposition rate in clay soil. It makes it really hard for a plant to thrive. Next, we have sandy soil. So sandy soil is pretty much the opposite of clay soil. It tends to be composed of bigger particles than clay. Clay tends to have a very small particle size, which contributes to the compaction factor of that soil. Sandy soil doesn't really compact at all. The particles are really large. It has a very low organic matter content, and although sandy soil does have a lot of air inside of it, it doesn't have the ability to really hold moisture very well. And moisture is another thing that's essential when decomposing organic material and making the nutrients from that material available for plants. Because sandy soil doesn't hold water very well, any nutrients that are in that soil tend to leach out with the water. So not only does that soil not hold water, it also doesn't hold the nutrients. So the final major category of soil is loamy soil. Loamy soil is considered to be like the best kind of soil that you can have. Loamy soil tends to have a lot of organic matter in it. It holds nutrients really well. That soil contains air as well as it retains moisture really well. And the two of those factors together allow the organic matter in it to decompose really well. Because it holds onto it instead of just leaching it out like a sandy soil does, loamy soil tends to make those nutrients very bioavailable to plants, which is why plants do so well in it. They have their nutrient, water, and air needs met very well in loamy soil. So one of the main factors that make the loamy soil so nice is the fact that there is a lot of organic matter in it. Organic matter is extremely important in the soil. You need to have it present in order for there to be nutrients available for the plants. Nutrients become available from organic matter through the decomposition process, like I mentioned. When organic matter decomposes, at that point it's called humus. The humus is what the plants are actually using as their nutrient source. It's not the original organic matter that went into the soil. That decomposition process is happening through soil microbes and other inhabitants in the soil, such as earthworms and fungi and insects. They're all helping this organic matter break down to make very rich, nutrient-dense soil. When you take about a tablespoon of soil, that tablespoon has about 50 million microbes in it, which is to me, just astonishing. They're absolutely necessary in the formation of really good soil, and which in turn is going to result in really good plant growth. The next factor of soil that I want to mention is pH. So pH is just talking about the acidity of the soil. Most garden plants, fruit trees, and things like that like to have a rounded neutral soil, which is about a 6.5 to 7 pH. There are a few exceptions to that, like blueberries like it a little more acidic, around a 5, and asparagus, although it does really well with a more neutral soil, it can thrive with a pH up to 8. Why is pH important in the soil? There is a whole chemistry process that we could go into, but the simple answer is the pH directly affects the bioavailability of nutrients in the soil. Without the correct pH in your soil, your plants are not going to be nearly as efficient in taking up the nutrients in the soil as they would be with the correct pH. As far as the nutrients in the soil goes, most of us have heard of the main nutrients, what you see on all the fertilizer packets as NPK. NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are considered the most important macronutrients for a plant because those are the nutrients that the plant requires the most of. There are many other nutrients that are considered micronutrients that the plants also require to be well balanced and nutrient dense. The most important micronutrients that a plant needs is magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. These are considered micronutrients because the plant needs them in much smaller quantities than the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That doesn't mean they're not as important though. To have a plant that's thriving and that's producing fruit or vegetables that are nutrient dense for you, having the right amount of macro and micronutrients in the soil is very important. So then how do you know if your soil has the right pH, if it has the appropriate amount of organic matter, and if it has the nutrients necessary for your plants to thrive? To find out the answers to that, you'll want to do a soil test. Now, a soil test is going to be the best way to determine what your nutrient profile is. When you do a soil test, it will have a readout of all of the most important nutrients, probably plus some, and it'll tell you a value of what you have enough of, what you might have too much of, and what you might have too little of. A lot of times soil tests will also test for things like heavy metals and things like that in your soil that you want to be careful of, because those are the type of things that you don't want your plant to take up. In general, for soil testing, it's recommended to do it about every 3 years, unless you get a soil test back and it shows an extreme of something, either an extremely low value of something or an extremely high value of something. Then it's recommended to test every year until those numbers kind of come back into balance. And then you can switch over and do it about every 3 years. That's what's recommended. It doesn't mean that's what you have to do, and for those of you that are starting, I don't think I would recommend necessarily worrying as much about the soil tests. I would say get your feet wet first and then worry about them, because although they provide really important information, they can also kind of be a little bit overwhelming. And when you're getting started, you want to make it as easy for yourself as possible. Regardless of whether you're doing a raised bed, a container, or an in-ground garden, I would recommend just kind of getting started at first. If you're doing an in-ground bed and you have any reason to kind of suspect that your soil might not be balanced, that's when I would recommend go ahead and doing a soil test before you plant too much into that soil. Because you're going to want to know if you need to provide any amendments to the soil to make sure that your plants have what they need to grow properly. There are many different places you can do a soil test depending on the area that you're in. A lot of home garden stores and places like that provide soil tests that you can just go and buy and do yourself. However, those tend to not be very accurate. So I wouldn't recommend really going that route. Instead, there are conservation districts, county extension offices, different universities that offer soil testing. And those tend to be lab tested. They are very accurate, and they're going to be your best bet to figure out exactly where your soil is and what you need to add to it to make sure that it is the ideal environment for your plants. So you might be asking, what about the bagged soil that you can just go to the store and you can buy? That could be potentially a really great option. And there are typically 3 different types of soil that you can buy at like a big box store or a nursery or someplace like that. The first type is going to be garden soil. And this soil is meant to be used in the ground. Garden soil tends to be dense and heavy. It has a lot of nutrients with some woody debris. It tends to hold moisture really well, a little bit too well for a raised bed or a container. Because it holds that water so well and it's so heavy and dense, it compacts very easily. So the best use for garden soil is for in the ground when you're mixing it with the soil you already have on the ground. So it's meant to be more like an amendment to that soil instead of being used as the only medium you're planting your plants in. Then we have potting soil. So potting soil is a mix of organic matter as well as amendments that improve the density and the water retention of the soil. Those amendments are usually either perlite or vermiculite. It also tends to have some woody debris mixed into it to also help make that soil more light, more airy, and a little bit better suited to a container environment. So it's not going to compact like garden soil is. It's also built to retain the appropriate amount of water and drain out the excess. So you're not going to flood your plant in a pot. Well, it's less likely you're going to flood your plant in a pot. It's still possible. I have done it before, but using the right kind of soil in the container is definitely going to help out. The last type of soil I want to talk about is the raised bed soil. Now, raised bed soil is about a 50-50 mix of topsoil and potting soil. So it's a little bit heavier, a little bit denser than just potting soil, but it's not nearly as heavy and dense as a garden soil. The mix of topsoil and potting soil creates the ideal conditions for plants in a raised bed situation outside. So a potting soil mix can be used inside or outside. A raised bed potting mix is really meant to be used outside, where it's going to be exposed to elements. It's going to have all of those microbes and insects and earthworms and all of those really wonderful things that are found in your soil. All of that is going to travel up into your raised bed and populate that raised bed soil as well. And the raised bed soil is perfectly mixed for that kind of situation. That was a lot of information. I hope you got something out of it. If you have questions, just put them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. I'm going to link a couple sources down in the description box that I used when I was researching a few things for this video. Feel free to take a deeper dive into it. They're very detailed, very fascinating, but to warn you, they kind of read a bit more along the lines of a scientific paper. If you haven't seen videos 1 and 2 in this series, I will also link those down in the description box below. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you next time.